Have you ever wondered why some people always seem to get what they want? Effortlessly, invisibly, almost like magic. The truth is not luck and it's not charm. Hidden in the shadows of history lies a secret system of seduction and influence, a knowledge that the powerful have used for centuries to control nations, leaders, and even minds just like yours. Today, we reveal the forbidden techniques they never wanted you to know. By the end of this video, you'll see the invisible forces shaping your choices, desires, and loyalty. And you'll discover how to finally recognize them before it's too late. Before we dive into the Forbidden Book of Seduction, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're the first to uncover the secrets the world doesn't want you to know. Don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone ready to see the truth. Get ready, because what you're about to learn could change the way you understand power and control forever. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Empire's Hidden Murmur. There is a sound that never reaches the ear, but rearranges the shape of history. It moves like a current beneath the visible sea, soft enough to be mistaken for the weather, precise enough to steer entire continents. Empires are not only forged by armies and walls, they are woven by small, steady pressures. A rumor here, a story repeated there, a habit turned into law. This chapter begins with that quiet, the whisper that controls empires. Imagine a city that wakes to the same songs, the same markets, the same ritual bows. No single soldier forces the people to behave. No single decree snaps the life into place. Instead, 1,000 tiny persuaders, a school of thought, a favored poet, a grain tax, a public custom, shift what people expect and what they accept. Influence arrives like dawn. It is not dramatic. It is inevitable. It is invisible until one morning the map reads differently and no one remembers exactly when the change took hold. Silent seduction is a force of suggestion. It relies on the human hunger to belong, to make sense, to reduce the pain of thinking. When a symbol is admired enough, when a phrase is repeated until it tastes like truth, when a few respected voices begin to agree, obedience grows like ivy, slowly, beautifully, and then so completely that tearing it away seems impossible. Empires built on spectacle and violence burn bright and fall fast. Empires built on shared meanings and softened consent last. Their power is not announced with trumpets. It arrives in the quiet acceptance of daily life. Psychology is the secret engine under this machinery. People rarely rebel against what they think is natural. If a law seems to follow a tradition, if a leader feels like a necessary steward, if scarcity feels normal, few will question the story behind it. Minds prefer stories that reduce anxiety. A whispered narrative that explains inequality, that frames defeat as fate or success as virtue, answers that need. When a story comforts, people trade a little freedom for a sense of order. That exchange is the currency of quiet control. Leaders who understand this do not always need to shout. They sow tastes, design schools, fund festivals, encourage certain artists and silence others. They shape the language of praise and blame. Over decades, small choices accumulate. Children learn them at home, teachers teach them at school, and priests name them holy. The result is a culture that moves like a single organism, because its parts have been taught to move together. This is not mere propaganda in the crude sense. It is the art of making a way of life feel like the only possible life. There is also a moral grammar to this seduction. People obey who they trust, and they trust what seems inevitable. When a policy is framed as the only reasonable option, when dissent is painted as dangerous or naive, the act of obedience becomes not a surrender but prudent. Nations follow not always because they fear punishment, but because they see conformity as wisdom. The softest leash is the one people hold willingly, because it promises stability and meaning. Resistance to such power is fragile because it must change more than laws. It must change habit and belief. To challenge a whisper is to unravel an entire web of small concessions made over a lifetime. That is why revolutions that demand new stories are harder to win than battles that demand land. The whisper survives by making itself ordinary. It binds people through desire rather than fear. Desire to belong, to rise, to be seen as moral. Those who master silent seduction learn to present their interests as the common good, to wrap self-interest in the robe of virtue. When this succeeds, even the conquered feel like participants rather than victims. Yet there is a paradox. The same whisper that builds can also betray. When words become tools to hide cruelty, when comforts distract from theft, the culture that obeys will carry its own wounds into the future. The most dangerous empires are not those that oppress openly, but those whose people cannot imagine life otherwise. They consent to their own cages because the cage is polished, explained, and called home. So listen for the quiet patterns. Notice which stories are repeated in songs and laws. Watch what children are taught to admire. Pay attention to what is called natural and what is called scandalous. Power moves where attention flows. The whisper that controls empires is patient and invisible, and once it has done its work, it no longer needs to shout. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Blueprint. There are plans you cannot fold and maps you cannot read. Drawings traced not on paper but on habit and memory. This chapter begins with those secret blueprints, the architecture of invisible power that shapes how people think, love, fight, and obey. It is an architecture built from silence and ritual, from tiny repeated acts that become walls higher than stone. Elites learn early that buildings and armies can be seen and measured, but loyalty and meaning are softer tools. They design systems that teach people how to feel about their rulers and about each other. A flag becomes more than cloth when children salute it before they understand why. A ritual becomes more than movement when the rhythm tells the body where to belong. Myth is made to feel like truth by being told at weddings, in schools, and over graves. These are not accidents. They are deliberate choices that stitch a people to an idea. The secret blueprint is layered. At the base sits routine, the daily rhythms that shape time and desire. At the next level, institutions, schools, courts, markets, give those rhythms shape and sanction. Above them, symbols and stories give the system a soul. The highest layer is habit turned into identity. When this architecture is complete, power no longer needs to patrol the streets. It only needs to preserve the story. Those who build such systems know they will not always hold office, so they design influence to outlive them. They plant textbooks, fund art, create songs that will last longer than a lifetime. They shape rites of passage so the next generation inherits the feelings of the previous one. Power becomes archival, a set of comfortable defaults that future leaders can rely upon. This is why empires sometimes renew rather than fall. The architecture remains even when the faces change. Symbols are the bricks of this architecture. Flags, chants, medals, monuments. Each is a small claim about who belongs and who does not. When a symbol is everywhere, dissent feels lonely and unnatural. Rituals teach bodies how to bow, how to stand, how to clap at the right moment. Myths explain suffering as destiny and success as virtue. These silent objects and acts carry the heavy work of persuasion without appearing to do so. They translate complex politics into simple feelings: pride, shame, fear, duty. The manufacture of collective loyalty is less a trick than a craft. It requires patience and a subtle hand. Leaders reward the behaviors they want to see and quietly punish those they do not. They create public stories that place themselves at the moral center. They show mercy to some and law to others, teaching people whom to admire and whom to fear. Over time, this pattern becomes a grammar of social life, invisible rules that everyone learns without being told. Yet the architecture is not invincible. It depends on the repetition of small things: a teacher's lesson, a holiday parade, the tone of a newspaper. Change these small things and the foundation cracks. New stories, new songs, new rituals can rearrange loyalties faster than an army can march. That is why contesting power is often a matter of attention more than force. Look then for the quiet design in every public square. Notice which symbols are honored and which are hidden. Watch how rituals shape bodies and how stories shape hearts. Power that lasts builds with patience and taste. It is careful to make its grip feel like belonging. When you recognize the architecture, you see that domination is not always a shout. Sometimes it is the careful laying of a path that people will walk, day after day, thinking they chose the road themselves. Chapter 3. The Invisible Puppeteers. There is a room behind every throne, where the air tastes of paper and prayer, where maps are folded and unrolled by hands that never sign the laws. That room holds the quiet names: advisors, mystics, financiers, councils, the people who turn rulers into instruments and make crowns do what money and myth cannot do alone. This chapter begins in that shadow, where influence is practiced like a craft and power learns to hide its fingerprints. These unseen masters take many forms. Some are the holy men who whisper counsel and frame destiny. Some are the financiers who shape what is possible with a ledger. Others are the networked minds who design opinion and habit. History gives us clear images of this. The original Eminence Grey, a friar who guided Cardinal Richelieu's moves and lent his cloak a name for hidden counsel. The viziers of ancient kingdoms who served as the ruler's hand and memory, and the technocrats and political engineers of modern times who rewired public life through policy, propaganda, and institutions. Each example shows how unelected figures act through a visible leader and how their influence often outlives any single ruler. We call them grey eminences because they prefer the color of dusk, neither bright enough to be seen from a distance nor black enough to frighten. The friar who bent policy at the dawn of modern Europe became a legend. Not because he wore a crown, but because he made a cardinal's power feel inevitable. The vizier in ancient courts carried the state's memory, law, treasury, and judgment, and sometimes he stayed when kings fell. In the 20th century, engineers of politics used new instruments: mass media, social science, bureaucratic design, to build influence that looked like progress and felt like common sense. These are not conspiracies in the melodramatic sense. They are the practical art of shaping what people accept as normal. The psychology of ruling without being seen is simple and elegant. People follow when they think they choose. They obey when they trust the frame that explains their world. Invisible rulers do not force belief so much as make belief easy. They plant frames, a lesson here, a book there, a public ritual repeated, until the public mind learns to finish the sentence the advisor began. When power travels through a person who is loved or feared, it becomes both invisible and durable. The ruler is the face. The master behind the throne is the hand that shapes the smile. There is a moral thinness to this method. A secret counselor can steward a nation well, or they can turn governance into the management of consent. They can teach a people to flourish, or they can teach them to accept constraints as virtue. The danger is that when influence is invisible, accountability is too. That is why the study of these masters matters. Not to hunt ghosts, but to see the patterns they leave, the textbooks they funded, the holidays they shaped, the rituals they preserved. And to remember that power that hides will always prefer to be loved rather than feared. Listen for the quiet architecture. In any capital, The names that never make headlines, the policies that feel inevitable, the stories repeated until doubt fades. Behind every great face of rule, there is often a quieter craftsman shaping the tools of obedience, and understanding them is the first step toward altering the course they have already begun to draw. Chapter 4. The Enchantment of the Many. There is a story that moves faster than any messenger, a voice that does not speak but sings, and when enough ears learn its tune, an entire people will hum along without knowing why. This chapter begins with that song, the seduction of the masses, the gentle weaving of feeling and story that teaches crowds how to love, fear, and obey. Narration is the engine of nations. A tale told well organizes memory and gives confusion a shape. Leaders and architects of influence understand that facts without story are like seeds without soil. When history is shaped into heroism, when defeat is framed as sacrifice, the past becomes a lesson that demands certain futures. Culture supplies the storylines, songs, films, school books, monuments, and these items carry emotion like a flame carries heat. People do not simply learn what happened, they learn how to feel about what happened. That feeling then becomes a compass for action. Emotional manipulation through culture is subtle, because it often feels like home. A national anthem pressed at the chest, a festival that returns each year, a film that shows enemies as monsters, all teach the heart where to stand. Symbols cut short complicated arguments. Flags and colors and chants do the heavy lifting of meaning so people do not have to work through it logically. Fear is the sharpest of these tools. When the story includes danger just beyond the border, or moral decay inside the gates, then obedience wears the face of protection. People will trade liberty for the promise of safety if the story tells them it is wise. The art of creating national myths is not mere fabrication. It is careful selection. Myths take small truths, exaggerate them, and hang them in public places until they are accepted as foundations. A single battle can become ancestral destiny. A humble leader can be carved into a savior. A natural disaster can be told as punishment or test. Myths simplify complexity into moral lessons. They make strangers kin and make obedience a form of love. Once a myth anchors itself in ritual, it resists contradiction, because the ritual enlists the body and the mind together. Crowd psychology explains how millions are guided by whispers. People look to one another to know how to behave. In uncertain moments, they seek the cues of others and follow what seems common. This tendency is a shortcut that keeps life possible, but it is also a highway for influence. When a chant begins in one corner and is echoed in another, the sound becomes proof that many believe. When a city claps at the right time, the applause tells more than joy. It tells whose side the crowd is on. Large groups feel less alone when they move in unison, and that feeling becomes addictive. Leaders who master this rhythm can turn small gatherings into mass conviction. There is a moral cost to seducing the masses. When emotion outpaces reason, societies become slow to see their own mistakes. The crowd that believes itself righteous will excuse cruelty and silence doubt. The most dangerous spell is the one that makes cruelty feel noble and surrender feel wise. Resistance must therefore begin not only in policy but in stories, in the books we read, the songs we sing, the small rituals we teach children. To change a nation's direction is to change the story its people tell themselves. Watch closely the narratives that surround you. Notice which fears are fed and which hopes are nourished. Ask who benefits when a myth grows and who is erased by it. The seduction of the masses works because it is woven into the textures of daily life. To unravel it, we must learn to listen to the whispers and then bravely speak a different story. Chapter 5. The Silent Engines of Control. There is a machine that asks for nothing and takes everything. It hums in living rooms, in classrooms, on screens, and in the quiet between conversations. It does not lock doors or brand hands. It offers stories, lessons, and jokes that feel like comfort. This chapter begins with that gentle hum, the soft power machinery that seduces minds until consent looks like common sense. Soft power works by making certain ideas normal, long before anyone calls them law. A television show teaches a way of life. A history book selects which heroes to remember. A song frames who is lovable and who is dangerous. These are small mechanisms, repeated without force, until they shape desire and judgment. People adopt tastes and language first, and loyalties follow. When entertainment and education share the same tune, the tune becomes the public ear. It plays beneath political decisions and makes disagreement feel out of sync. Stories are the links in this chain. A good story does not simply tell, it teaches how to feel. When a hero is admired for a certain kind of courage, that trait becomes a model. When villains are always given the same faces and motives, whole groups learn to fear or despise without knowing why. Over time, stories harden into habits of the heart and mind. They become the frames through which events are read and choices are made. What began as fiction becomes a private grammar for public life. Language is the machine's most subtle lever. Words can be shaped, so pain is called necessary, or injustice is called reform. New phrases reframe old problems and narrow the space for thought. When a word gains weight, it can close doors. Debate shrinks because the vocabulary to describe alternatives has been removed. Those who control language control the map of possibility. Semantic shifts happen slowly. A phrase here, a headline there. Until people think in the terms that were prepared for them, this is not merely spin. It is the slow architecture of consent. Education and media are the makers and maintainers of this architecture. Schools decide which pasts to teach and which questions to encourage. News decides what is urgent and what can be ignored. Entertainment normalizes behavior by showing us who wins and why. Together they form a conveyor belt. Ideas move from creators to audiences, to institutions until they feel inevitable. Manufacturing consent, therefore, becomes an industrial process of repetition, selection, and omission, rather than a spectacle of force. The craft of this machinery is often invisible because it softens itself into pleasures we choose willingly. A sitcom that comforts, a textbook that simplifies, a viral clip that amuses. None of these look like tools of power. Yet when repeated across years and generations, they produce a public that aligns without being pushed. The most enduring control is consent that has the warmth of choice. There is a moral question here that cannot be avoided. When consent is manufactured, who benefits and who is diminished? When language narrows, which futures are closed? The answer matters not only to politics, but to the small life choices we make, whom we love, what we fear, what we dream. To resist soft power is not to ban stories, but to diversify them, to teach critical habits, to name words clearly and refuse easy frames. It is to ask why a certain tune plays and whether another might do better. Listen for the hum and then learn its turn. Notice which stories repeat, which words reshape meaning, which comforts quietly require your assent. The soft power machinery will keep humming. The wiser duty is to choose the music we will let into our bone. Chapter 6. The Veil of False Freedom. There is a mirror that pretends to show freedom while the hand that arranges the glass decides what fits inside the frame. This chapter begins at that mirror, where people feel the cool thrill of choosing while the choices themselves were quietly made for them. The illusion of choice is not a conspiracy shouted from rooftops. It is a gentle architecture of options that make obedience feel like preference. Most people believe they choose because choice is familiar and private. We point at ballots, menus, and markets and say freedom lives there. But look closer, and you will see paths that were paved long before your foot reached them. The shops on the street are there because certain investors once decided they should be. The headlines you read are there because editors chose what to print. The candidates you can vote for are often those who fit a prearranged script. This is political theater, a performance designed to make the audience feel powerful while the stage directions remain invisible. The play is convincing because it respects the form of choice. There are voices, debates, and gestures that imitate conflict, yet the real boundaries are set behind the curtain. Important questions are framed in ways that exclude alternatives. The most effective control is not banning options, but making some options seem ridiculous, impossible, or unthinkable. When the frame narrows, even sincere choice follows the rail. People choose within a space they did not build, and because the space feels natural, they believe the choice was theirs. Understanding how this is done leads us to a quiet model of manipulated decision-making. At the first layer, attention is shaped. What people think about is managed by which issues are made visible. At the second layer, options are curated, which solutions are presented, and which are omitted. At the third layer, meaning is assigned. Words and symbols tell people which options are wise and which are reckless. All three layers work together so that by the time a decision appears, it carries the weight of a chosen necessity. The person who votes, signs, or consents experiences the final act as personal, but that feeling is the result of long, invisible preparation. Silent control built this way is often more stable than open dictatorship. A heavy-handed ruler rules by fear. Consent-based systems rule by comfort. When people believe they chose, they defend the choice. They argue for it, explain it, and teach it to their children. Stability that comes from belief survives the loss of a single leader because the structure of preference remains. The whisper that made an option seem natural continues to echo in homes and media long after a ruler has left the stage. There is a moral strain to this truth. The illusion of choice can preserve peace and order, but it can also hide injustices under the polite language of preference. When alternatives are never presented, society narrows without noticing. The cure is not to shout that people are fooled, that often hardens the mirror, but to widen the field gently. Introduce new stories, build new institutions, teach critical habits. Make visible the small decisions that add up. Who owns the newsstands? Who writes the textbooks? Who chooses the candidates? Once these hidden arrangements are seen, the space of choice expands. So stand before the mirror and look for the frame. Ask who cut the glass and why. Notice which options appear suddenly and which are missing like holes in a familiar map. The world will always offer choices, but the deepest freedom is to know which choices were prepared and to insist on making new ones anyway. Chapter 7. The Crown's Secret Chains. There is a loneliness at the top that sounds like applause and smells like danger. That solitude becomes a room full of mirrors, each one offering a flattering reflection and a blade hidden at the frame. This chapter begins in that room, where rulers believe they stand alone, when in truth they are walked, coaxed, and cupped by hands that never appear in the photograph. The seduction of leaders is the quiet art of making the powerful feel inevitable, while someone else writes the script. Power has its own predators. Advisors with subtle webs of loyalty, intelligence services that feed selected truths, foreign powers that offer favors wrapped in strings, and the bureaucracy that rewards conformity. These forces do not always speak in orders. They speak in reports, in questions asked at the right time, in timing a piece of information to arrive when the leader is tired or proud. Influence works where the leader is weakest, in the places of hunger for approval, fear of failure, or desire for an immortal name. When those hungers are known, they become levers. Psychology explains how this control is so effective. Humans are social creatures. Leaders are no exception. They seek counsel, reassurance, and confirmation because the weight of decision isolates them. A steady voice that affirms their intuition becomes a trusted compass. A clever advisor will not oppose the ruler outright, but will shape the ruler's view by shaping the options presented. Intelligence does not merely gather facts, it interprets them, and interpretation can become a map that the leader follows without seeing the hand that drew it. Foreign influence often offers small comforts, loans, praise, access, that make dependency feel like partnership. Then there are the honey traps of power: ego, legacy, and fear. Ego flatters and narrows judgment. It makes a leader hungry for applause rather than truth. Legacy seduces by promising a story carved in stone, so short-term caution is traded for long-term monument. Fear is the oldest of all levers. Fear of being seen as weak, fear of losing control, fear of history's judgment. These desires are not criminal in themselves, but they become tools when turned into currency. Those who know how to exchange in those currencies can steer outcomes while the ruler thinks they are steering. The most dangerous moment is the one when a leader believes themselves free. The belief of freedom binds more tightly than chains, because it removes the need to resist. A convinced ruler will defend decisions with a zeal that looks like conviction, but is often the echo of someone else's counsel. This is why hidden influence survives beyond any single career. It travels through stories, rewards, and institutions that outlast faces and names. Yet this is not only a tale of manipulation. It is also a human story about fallibility. Leaders are people who carry histories, loves, and fears. To understand how they are seduced is not merely to expose trickery, but to see how systems can be kinder and how counsel might be given without capture. The cure is simple and demanding: transparency, plural advice, public accountability, and the discipline to welcome contradiction. Listen for the small arrangements around power. Who sits beside the ruler at dinner, whose reports are unread, whose praise is repeated? Remember that the crown can blind as much as it crowns. True freedom in leadership is less the absence of constraints, and more the presence of honest mirrors and hard questions that cannot be bought. Chapter 8. The Whispering Empires. There are conversations that never make it to the evening news, letters that are never signed, and gifts that arrive with strings invisible to the eye. This chapter begins in those quiet corridors where nations speak without microphones and shape the world by soft means. The most effective empires learn to move like weather, unseen, patient, and enormous in consequence. When states seduce states, they do not always send armies. They send money that arrives as investment, scholarships that make young minds lean one way, cultural centers that teach a language, and a taste for a certain story. They open markets and shut others, build ports and coax loyalties, fund artists and newspapers. These acts are polite and legal, but they come with an expectation. A neighbor who benefits will speak kindly, vote gently, and ignore an inconvenient truth. Influence travels on the currency of favors and on the comfort of quiet cooperation. Backdoor diplomacy is the craft of talking where cameras cannot follow. Envoys meet in private rooms, businessmen carry messages in contracts, and soft promises become binding through habit. Deals made in shadow protect faces and allow plausible deniability. When negotiations are hidden, leverage becomes a slow pressure. A loan delayed, a project paused, a visa held back. These are small brakes that steer large machines. Nations learn to use inconvenience as a gentle hand on the wheel. Economic manipulation works through dependency. When a country's railways, ports, or loans are controlled by an outsider, decisions that once seemed domestic grow international footprints. Debt can be a leash when repayment depends on choosing the right partner. Trade preferences teach producers what to grow and whom to serve. Over time, patterns of commerce shape politics. Leaders who rely on foreign funds learn to avoid policies that would threaten those funds. Influence thus becomes structural, not merely persuasive. Cultural infiltration is quieter, but deeper. Films, music, and education carry ideas disguised as entertainment or expertise. A television series shows a way of life that seems attractive. A university scholarship creates alumni who speak kindly of their benefactor. An NGO teaches a method of organization that becomes the standard. These soft exports recode preferences and norms. When a culture admires another, it borrows its politics, its habits, and sometimes its loyalties. The invisible wars of influence are fought in boardrooms and classrooms, in think tanks and social feeds. They prize patience and subtlety over speed and spectacle. A broken bridge here, a friendly article there, a well-timed cultural festival. Each seems trivial alone, but together they redraw alliances without a single casualty. Empire building through whispers is thus not weaker than conquest. It is more sustainable because it hides in the pleasure of benefit and the inertia of institutions. There is a moral shadow to these tactics. They can bring development, exchange, and learning, but they can also erode autonomy and narrow imagination. A nation that wakes to find its choices shaped by outside tastes may lose not only policy independence, but the quieter liberties of self-definition. The hardest thing to guard is not borders, but stories. The tale a people tell about who they are and who they ought to become. So watch the slow currents. Notice who pays for the schools, whose films fill the screens, which loans arrive with friendly advisors. Ask whether a new bridge is a gift or an invitation to alter a map. In the subtle diplomacy of states, consent is contagious, and allegiance is often a trained habit. The shadows of global politics are not empty darkness, but rooms furnished with favors, narratives, and patient design. And once they settle, they can hold a world in their quiet hands. Chapter 9. The Mind's Invisible Prison. There is a quiet factory inside the human mind where meaning is made and loyalty is assembled. It is not visible to the eye, but it shapes how millions decide together, how crowds turn into nations, how a symbol can make strangers feel like family. This chapter begins in that hidden place, where biology meets story and the small machinery of the brain learns to march in time with the world. Our brains are built to seek pattern and belonging. Long before we could read or vote, we lived in groups where cooperation kept us alive. That heritage still colors our thinking. When a flag, a song, or a story signals who belongs inside the circle, ancient circuits reward us with comfort and reduced anxiety. Identity lights a different part of the mind than reason does. Facts are weighed, but belonging feels immediate. A person can know an argument is weak and still defend it fiercely. If it protects the self they carry inside their chest. Symbols work because they shortcut thought. A single emblem can stand for 1,000 beliefs, fears, and memories all at once. The brain prefers shortcuts. They save energy. When symbols are repeated, on walls, in schools, through songs, the shortcut becomes a groove. The more we travel it, the harder it is to step off. That is why nations use ceremonies, monuments, and shared music to train brains to feel in certain ways before they reason about them. Cognitive bias is the tool that makes this training so effective. We prefer information that confirms what we already believe. We follow the crowd when uncertain because the crowd is, in a sense, our social proof. We remember stories that are simple and emotional more easily than complex analyses. These tendencies are not flaws, but features of a brain made to act fast in a dangerous world. Yet in the modern arena of mass politics, they can be guided. A message framed for emotion travels farther than a careful study framed for nuance. Leaders and institutions that understand these truths do not always coerce. They cultivate environments where the right responses feel natural. They tell stories that make loyalty feel like love, frame threats that make obedience feel like protection, and name enemies so that suspicion becomes a habit. Over time, these practices change preferences at a large scale. The more a society rehearses certain reactions, the more those reactions become reflexive. There is also a psychological economy to collective obedience. People trade autonomy for certainty. When the world is confusing, a clear story that explains suffering, names a hero, and promises stability becomes valuable. It reduces the burden of constant choice. That bargain can be benign or dangerous. It can preserve social order or lock a people into harmful patterns. The same circuits that helped early humans survive can bind modern citizens to myths that no longer serve them. Understanding the science of obedience is not an indictment of the many who love their country or find solace in shared ritual. It is an invitation to see how feelings are shaped. When we know the levers, symbols, repetition, emotion, and bias, we can choose differently. We can teach children to ask not only what they feel, but why they feel it. We can build rituals that bind without blinding, stories that include nuance, and schools that teach both history and doubt. Look inside the quiet factory and learn its machines. Notice which symbols move you and why. Ask whether your loyalty comforts you or narrows you. The goal is not to remove loyalty, which is human and often noble, but to make it honest, examined and chosen rather than merely inherited. When societies take that step, obedience becomes not a shadow over freedom, but a conscious weight we agree to carry together. Chapter 10. The Algorithmic Spell. There is a new kind of whisper that travels at the speed of light and knows what you are likely to want before you do. It does not speak with a voice you can hear. It nudges the edges of your attention. It learns which pictures make you pause, which headlines make you click, and then it arranges the world so those pauses and clicks become habits. This chapter begins with that unseen architect, the algorithm, a quiet gardener pruning desire and shaping what millions come to think is normal. Algorithms are not neutral. They are built to maximize attention, to keep eyes on screens and thumbs moving. In doing so, they reward what moves us fast. Anger, certainty, novelty. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds trust. When a platform shows us the same kinds of stories again and again, our minds learn to expect them. What looked like choice, the freedom to follow, like, or share, becomes a gentle funnel. The options appear wide, but the paths that lead most quickly to reward are narrow and well-paved. Influence campaigns now operate with a precision that would have seemed magical 50 years ago. Messages can be crafted for narrow audiences and delivered at the moment their minds are most open. Ads, bots, and tailored posts can echo the very language a community uses, slipping into conversations like a trusted neighbor with a new piece of news. Networks of influence can amplify small ideas into wide movements. Whole populations can be nudged by many small pushes that together feel like a storm, not a plan. The illusion of digital freedom is persuasive because it looks like permission. You choose the accounts you follow, the videos you watch. Yet those choices were shaped by designs you did not make. Recommendation systems learn from you and from millions like you. They show what keeps engagement high, not necessarily what is true or wise. The more the system knows, the more it can predict, and the more it predicts, the less you have to decide. Choice becomes a set of comfortable defaults, delivered by a machine that profits when you do not stray. Psychological cyber warfare is the darker application of these tools. When actors study emotion and attention at scale, they can weaponize stories. Fear is cheap currency online. A crafted image, a forged account, a rushed hashtag can create panic, shame, or rage faster than institutions can respond. The goal is often not to win an argument, but to change what people feel and what they trust. In this field, truth is less important than effect, and the battlefield is attention itself. Yet the digital whisper has a double edge. What shapes can also be reshaped. The same tools that manipulate can educate, connect, and reveal. The skill is not only technical but moral, to design systems that slow attention rather than speed it, that favor nuance over outrage, that protect collective spaces from engineered harm. Citizens can learn new habits too, to question the obvious, to check the small claim before sharing, to widen the circle of sources they trust. Look at your screen as a room where someone has arranged the furniture. Ask whose hand moved the chair and why. Notice what keeps returning to you, and who benefits when you accept it. The digital age gives unprecedented reach to quiet seduction. It makes it easier to whisper to millions and harder for a single voice of reason to be heard. The task now is to learn the grammar of those whispers, to teach restraint into our devices, and to insist that the invisible rulers of attention be shaped by public values rather than private appetite. Chapter 11. The Endless Web of Power. There is a game that has been played since the first walls were built and the first crowns placed upon heads. It is a game without end, without a final winner, and yet it shapes the fate of empires, the lives of millions, and the very way humans see the world. This chapter begins in that timeless arena, where silent seduction moves like a river beneath the surface of history, invisible yet unstoppable. Silent control is not a new invention. Every civilization has known it in its own way. The pharaohs of Egypt, the senators of Rome, the sultans of distant empires, all learned that power is most secure when it whispers. When obedience is cultivated through story, ritual, and subtle reward rather than overt force, nations rise and fall, leaders are praised and forgotten, yet the methods endure. Influence flows from one generation to the next, sometimes disguised in a new ideology, sometimes hidden beneath the symbols of a modern state, but always present, always shaping choices and expectations. The cyclical nature of influence is striking. One empire seduces through religion, another through trade, another through culture or technology. The forms change, the tools shift, but the principle remains. People follow patterns they believe they choose, and leaders accept guidance they believe is advice. Revolutions may break, borders may redraw, yet the quiet currents of persuasion continue. The tricks, the rituals, the subtle nudges, they pass from old hands to new, from one society to another, like water moving from one basin to the next. Power transitions quietly, even when it seems dramatic. When an old empire falls, it rarely leaves a vacuum. Its institutions, myths, and networks of influence persist, often absorbed by the rising state. The conquerors learn that it is easier to adopt the tools that have already shaped obedience than to invent entirely new ones. Legacy becomes leverage. Symbols, ceremonies, and hierarchies travel across generations, giving new rulers a foundation on which to build, and the people a framework they already understand. Change is therefore only apparent. Continuity runs beneath it like a hidden current. This hidden continuity explains why societies that appear different are in fact remarkably similar. The stories that govern loyalty, the rituals that mark belonging, the invisible agreements that shape behavior, They are threads woven through centuries, subtly adjusted but never fully erased. Leaders may change, ideologies may shift, technology may advance, yet the silent mechanics of control remain constant. It is a game without a final score, but with rules that endure because they work. Recognizing this eternal game is both sobering and enlightening. It reveals that history is not only a record of battles and treaties, but a vast experiment in influence and obedience. The players change, the stakes fluctuate, yet the game itself is immortal. To understand it is not to win or to dominate, but to see clearly where the world moves beneath the surface, to notice how patterns are repeated, and to navigate them with awareness rather than blind participation. Watch history closely and you will notice the whispers. They may be faint, a ceremony repeated, a phrase taught to children, a story passed along in a new guise. Yet they are the same whispers that guided civilizations before you, and that will guide them long after. The eternal game of control never ends, and understanding its rules is the first step towards seeing clearly the hidden forces that shape nations, leaders, and even ourselves. Chapter 12. Eyes in the Shadow. There is a moment when the world seems ordinary, and then a quiet awareness shifts everything. You begin to notice the currents beneath the surface, the hands that move what feels immovable, the patterns that shape decisions you thought were your own. This chapter begins in that moment. The moment when the unseen becomes visible, when influence no longer hides behind ritual, story, or habit, and when the mind can reclaim the space it thought it had lost. Invisible power structures are everywhere, but they are not always cruel or loud. They are subtle, like water eroding stone over centuries. They guide attention, frame choices, and assign meaning. They work through culture, language, symbols, and expectations, often without ever giving themselves away. To see them, one must slow down, observe what is repeated, question what feels natural, and listen to the spaces between words. Awareness is the first weapon, and understanding is the first shield. Resisting manipulation does not require heroism, it requires mindfulness. One can practice small acts of mental independence, pausing before agreeing, noticing which stories stir emotion, questioning the motives behind convenient consensus. Critical thought is a muscle strengthened through habit, not a sudden revelation. When repeated across time, it allows a person to recognize influence without being trapped by it. It teaches discernment, to separate genuine guidance from crafted persuasion, to choose intentionally rather than reflexively. Reclaiming sovereignty of thought begins with language, the way we speak to ourselves and others. Words shape perception. They assign value, define enemies, and create comfort zones. Naming patterns, recognizing biases, and examining assumptions restores freedom within the mind. It is the realization that while the world offers narratives, we do not have to accept them without scrutiny. Freedom is not simply the absence of force, but the presence of reflection, the ability to pause in the midst of expectation and choose a path that feels authentic, not conditioned. Awareness also reveals that power does not vanish. It merely changes its disguise. Today's whispers become tomorrow's headlines. Traditions of influence morph into digital nudges. Ceremonies transform into viral symbols. The machinery endures, and yet the awakened mind can navigate it with clarity. To witness the unseen is not to defeat it entirely, but to no longer be invisible to it. It is to walk with knowledge of the currents, and to move without being carried blindly. The final step is subtle but profound, cultivating a personal map of reality. Observe the rituals that bind nations, the symbols that guide crowds, the stories that shape emotions. Notice how leaders are guided and how citizens are persuaded. See the patterns that repeat across centuries, across continents, across screens. And within that understanding, Cultivate choice to accept, to resist, or to redirect. It is the path toward true autonomy in a world where the machinery of influence is both eternal and patient. When you learn to see the unseen, the whispers lose their power over you. You begin to understand that obedience is often taught, consent is often engineered, and loyalty is often curated. Yet the awakened mind finds space between suggestion and action, between pressure and decision. This is the art of freedom in the age of silent seduction, the delicate, ongoing practice of noticing, reflecting, and choosing. And with that practice, you do not merely survive the currents of influence. You move through them consciously, guided by insight rather than manipulation, aware that power will always change its form, but never the fact that it exists. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're the first to uncover the secrets the world doesn't want you to know. Don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone ready to see the truth. Get ready for more audiobook. See you next.